They say history is written by the victors, but what if the truth was buried with the fallen? Every secret leaves a trace, if you know where to look. This is The Broken Truth, decoding history, one broadcast at a time. The Broken Truth podcast, where history meets conspiracy. Every case tells a story, every story hides a lie. Welcome back to the Broken Truth podcast. I'm your host, Garrett. This is going to be part 2 of the Tuskegee Deception, a little longer episode than I was expecting, but I believe it was necessary to drop this into 2 parts. So I'm no tech wizard by any means, but I'm learning something new every day in regard to lighting, cameras, and everything like that. So as you can probably tell, the quality of this episode is much better. Hopefully the audio quality is better as well. Messed with the background a little bit, the lighting, and within the months to come, we're actually going to change this background up completely, and it's going to be absolutely amazing. Looking forward to that, but let's hop right into this episode. So where we left off was part 4 of the Tuskegee Deception. So in July 1972, the long-held secret is about to explode into public view. We shift scenes to Washington, D.C., and the bustling offices of the Associated Press. Jean Heller, the 29-year-old reporter with the Special Assignment Team, sits at her typewriter, a look of grim determination on her face. Before her are the documents leaked by Peter Buxtun, cold bureaucratic papers that outline the years of the Tuskegee study. There are also notes from her own reporting, quotes from reluctant officials, background on syphilis, and a piece of information she dug up in the DC library confirming the study's existence in medical literature. She has double and triple checked the facts. Now she is crafting the story that will break the silence. On July 25th, 1972, the Washington Star, an afternoon newspaper in DC, hits newsstands and doorsteps with Heller's article on the front page. The headline is chilling, almost unbelievable. Syphilis victims in the U.S. Study went untreated for 40 years was the headline. The story is simultaneously released over the AP wire, ensuring it will appear in newspapers nationwide by the next morning. Heller's prose is straightforward, unflinching. She describes that since 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service, under the guise of a study, denied treatment to several hundred Black men with syphilis, even as they suffered and died, in order to observe the disease's progression. She notes that even after penicillin was proven effective, the men were deliberately not given the antibiotic. She calls them human guinea pigs, a phrase that sears into the public's mind. The reaction is immediate and volcanic. Readers are stunned. Many refuse to believe it at first. It sounds like some grotesque tale from a distant, less civilized past, or something one might expect of a cruel foreign regime, not the United States, not in the 20th century. But Heller's story is no rumor. It's backed by named sources and official confirmations. Indeed, the AP story includes remarks from a CDC official, Dr. J.D. Miller, who acknowledges serious moral problems with the study. Once Heller confronted the PHS with evidence, they couldn't deny the study existed. She had them dead to rights, so they moved to damage control, admitting it but trying to contextualize. Dr. Miller admits to the AP that it was too late to treat the men. Now, and that study should have been stopped post-war when penicillin emerged, effectively confirming the worst details. Within 24 hours, nearly every major newspaper has picked up the story. The New York Times runs it on the front page on July 26th, ensuring international attention. Television and radio news amplify that story that evening. Millions hear about it over dinner or in their cars, and as Black Americans in particular learn of it, a collective shudder and surge of anger spread through communities. Many in the civil rights movement had long suspected the government did not value Black lives, but here was bald evidence, an atrocity carried out in secret against Black bodies, sanctioned by federal officials. The NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, and other civil rights immediately demand answers and justice. Meanwhile, down in Alabama, the men in the study and their families are learning the truth for the first time from newspapers and TV. Try to put yourself in one of their shoes. Say you're Mr. Herman Shaw, age 68 in 1972, a farmer and one of the syphilis patients in the Tuskegee study. You've been a loyal participant since the 30s. You even proudly have a certificate of appreciation from the PHS from your years of service. On the evening of July 26th, you're sitting in your modest home and your nephew rushes in with the newspaper. Uncle, he says breathlessly, you need to read this. Your eyes scan the article. You see phrases like study of untreated syphilis and never given real medicine. And first, maybe you don't grasp it, untreated. But Nurse Rivers gave me pills. Those were vitamins. You feel a chill as the truth dawns. The article is describing you, your life, but from a perspective you never had. It says the government wanted to see you get worse. It says they watched your friends die and did nothing. Shaw's hands might tremble, the paper rattling. You think back to the spinal tap that knocked you flat for days. They called it treatment, but it was just a test. You think of your friend Freddie, who died in 1960 from syphilis. You recall how the doctors clucked and took notes even on his deathbed. You realized with growing horror, they betrayed us. Shaw's shock turns to anger, then perhaps to sorrow. It's a lot for an old man to process. Herman Shaw, in reality, was one of the survivors who would speak out later, with dignity and forgiveness, despite what was done. Another man, Mr. Charlie Pollard, reads the news and feels rage boiling. Pollard had joined the study as a young man. He, like others, truly believed the government was helping him. Upon learning the truth, Pollard doesn't just curse and cry. He calls a lawyer. Specifically, he reaches out to Fred Gray, a prominent civil rights attorney in Alabama. Gray had represented Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. during the Montgomery bus boycott. Pollard asks Gray, "Can we sue the government for this?" Gray, reading the news himself, is appalled and immediately starts assembling a legal strategy. This will lead to the class action lawsuit we'll discuss in Act 5. The United States government officialdom reacts as well, albeit somewhat slower than the public. Within days, the Department of Education and Welfare, HEW, which oversaw the PHS CDC at that time, announces it is convening an ad hoc advisory panel to investigate the Tuskegee study. This is a classic bureaucratic move from a panel. Pledge a thorough review in the Senate. Senator Edward M. Kennedy swiftly schedules a hearing of the Senate Subcommittee on Health. On Capitol Hill in early August 1972, flashbulbs pop and television cameras whir as from HEW and the CDC sit in the hot seat before indignant lawmakers. Senator Kennedy, flanked by colleagues, black and white, liberal and conservative, delivers an opening statement that drips with moral outrage. He calls the Tuskegee study an indictment of America's healthcare priorities and demands to know how in God's name this could happen. Over the course of Peter Buxtun testifies. The young whistleblower steps forward into public view, a soft-spoken man with a mustache and a calm demeanor, recounting how he discovered the study and tried to stop it. His testimony is riveting. He essentially confirms that the PHS ignored internal warnings, also testifying might be officials like Dr. Miller or Dr. Heller, by then who have retired. Some of these officials try to rationalize saying things like times were different in the 1930s, or we were going to treat them eventually at endpoint. But these justifications fall flat. One senator reputedly compares the study's doctors to the infamous Nazi doctor Mengele, a hyperbolic but emotionally storytelling comparison of how people. The hearing and media coverage turned the Tuskegee study into a national scandal overnight. Public outcry is intense. Editorials in newspapers from the Washington Post to the Chicago Tribune to small-town gazettes condemn the study as a disgrace to the medical profession and a glaring example of racism in science. Many draw parallels to the syphilis experiments in Guatemala, a separate travesty that wasn't widely known yet. It would come out in the 2000s that in the late 1940s, some of the same PHS researchers deliberately infected Guatemalan prisoners and patients with syphilis. That, ironically, remained hidden long. But Tuskegee alone is enough to prompt soul searching. How many other secrets lurk in medical closets? If the government could do this, what else might they have done? In Macon County, reporters descend. They interview the surviving men and their families. Photographs appear and on TV of these elderly black men with haunted eyes, standing by the tumble-down shacks or modest homes where they live out their twilight years. Now, as reluctant celebrities of a sort, living proof of an egregious wrong. The men's dignity in these interviews is often striking. Some express confusion. They still can't believe the government meant them harm. Others are clearly angry. They lied to me. Nurse Eunice Rivers also briefly comes under the spotlight. She's retired by 1972. She left the PHS around the time the study ended. A few journalists seek her comment. She mostly stays silent publicly, likely overwhelmed by the sudden vilification of the study she had been a part of. There's a sense of betrayal by her as well. Many think, how could a black nurse do this to her own people? It's complicated. She may have had mixed motives, but at that moment, nuance is lost in the flood of justifiable outrage. This leak doesn't just reveal facts, it changes lives on the spot. The government quickly decides to end the study immediately. Something the internal folks had resisted for 40 years is achieved in 48 hours of press coverage. HEW's officials announced that all surviving participants will be contacted and treated. Though, tragically for late-stage syphilis, treatment now only halts further progression. Damage can't be reversed. Mobile clinics are sent to Alabama to ensure every man, every infected wife, and every child with congenital syphilis gets penicillin or appropriate care. It's the least they can do. Jean Heller, the reporter, finds herself lauded for her scoop. She remains modest but emphasizes in interviews about the men, about a wrongdoing that needed airing. Her work inspires a generation of journalists to consider digging into medical and government misconduct stories. Tuskegee becomes a case study in the importance of investigative journalism. As Act 4 unfolds in those dramatic July and August days of 1972, consider the symbolic resonance. Americans are grappling with trust issues already. Watergate's first hints are stirring. Vietnam has eroded faith in leaders. Now, Tuskegee adds a layer. Trust in the healthcare system is shattered for many. African American communities, in particular, react with a profound sense of "I knew it. We cannot trust them." It validates their worst fears. Some elders recall how in their youth, whispers went around about black folk being used for experiments. It was often dismissed as paranoid folklore, but here it was, true in the worst way. This is how the Tuskegee name enters the lexicon as shorthand for racially based medical malfeasance. By the end of 1972, the immediate shock has turned into concrete action. The Tuskegee study is shut down, and the focus shifts to remedying and understanding what happened. The advisory panel appointed by HEW issues a report in 1973. That panel unequivocally calls the study ethically unjustified, an official stamp confirming what everyone knew by then. They state that the knowledge gained was disproportionately small compared to the risk and harm to subjects. They also recommend that the government never allow such a thing to happen again, urging new safeguards, which, as we'll see, leads to major changes in research ethics rules. So to sum up Act 4, the leak is the catharsis moment. Years of lies come to an end with truth's triumph. It's messy, painful, and far too late for many victims, but it's necessary. One day, the men were experimental subjects, unbeknownst to themselves. The next day, they were survivors of a medical scandal known worldwide. The deception, so carefully nurtured, crumbled in an instant under scrutiny. As the saying goes, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And in the searing light of public attention, the Tuskegee study could not survive. Yet, for all the drama of exposure, what came next was equally important: accountability and healing, or attempts at it. Act 5 will delve into the fallout, the legal reckoning, the steps toward compensating the victims, and the reforms instituted to ensure no future Tuskegee could happen in America. But the leak burst the dam. Now the nation had to deal with the flood of consequences. The immediate fallout of the Tuskegee revelation was a whirlwind of investigations, lawsuits, and public soul searching. The shock and anger that followed the leak soon galvanized into action on multiple fronts: political, legal, and institutional. In Act 5, we follow the trajectory from outrage to attempts at justice and reform. Late 1972 to 1973, government response and investigations. With the Tuskegee study terminated, the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HEW, moved to triage the damage. The ad hoc advisory panel they convened wasted no time reviewing records and interviewing those involved. In October 1972, even before their final report, the panel's chair publicly declared that the study was ethically unjustified and should have been stopped years earlier. This frank admission by government sanctioned panel was significant. It was the establishment acknowledging guilt. In March 1973, the advisory panel's official report was released. It pulled no punches in its condemnation. It faulted the Public Health Service for failing to obtain informed consent, for not offering treatment when it became available, and for allowing the study to continue without oversight. It criticized the assumptions of racism that underpin the study. The notion that these black men wouldn't seek or complete treatment anyway was both unproven and immoral as a justification. It recommended that in the future, no such study should ever be allowed to bypass basic ethical standards, and that a formal system of oversight would be established for human research. We'll see how that came to fruition shortly. Meanwhile, Congress took action beyond the Kennedy hearings. There were calls to codify rules around human subject research. People were asking, what other experiments might be out there? The result was the National Research Act, passed in 1974, which set up a commission to write regulations for research involving human subjects. This eventually led to the famous Belmont Report in 1979, outlining core ethical principles: respect for persons, beneficence, justice. And to that requirement, that institutional review boards, IRBs, review and approve any research involving humans, looking out for informed consent and welfare of subjects. These IRBs now stand in every university and research agency, are a direct legacy of Tuskegee's fallout, to ensure no single researcher or small team can ever again operate in such an insulated, unaccountable way. So here's the legal fallout and the lawsuit. On the legal front, one primary avenue for justice opened: a lawsuit against those responsible. In summer 1973, attorney Fred D. Gray, a legendary civil rights lawyer, filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the surviving Tuskegee participants, the infected family members, and the heirs of those who had died. Gray's involvement was fitting. He had fought Alabama's segregationists and now would take on the U.S. government itself in court. The lawsuit named numerous defendants, including the federal government and specific officials from the PHS and CDC. Gray argued that the men's constitutional rights had been violated and that they had been assaulted. Every blood draw and spinal tap without consent could be seen as battery, and that they suffered harm due to negligence and outright cruelty. The government, likely eager to avoid a drawn-out horrific public trial, opted to settle the lawsuit out of court in 1974. The terms of the settlement were significant: $10 million, equivalent to many times that in today's dollars, was to be paid. Each living participant with syphilis would get about $37,500, which is around $200,000 today, and each heir of a deceased participant about $15,000. The control group participants received a lesser amount. These sums were not trivial, couldn't possibly compensate for a lifetime of suffering or a lost loved one, but it was what the legal system offered as tangible redress. More importantly, for the survivors' present needs, the settlement pushed the government to establish the Tuskegee Health Benefit Program, guaranteeing all living participants and infected family members free lifetime medical care. Finally, they would receive proper treatment and attention, though tragically late. This program was funded through the U.S. Public Health Service. Over time, the benefits even extended to their children and eventually grandchildren born with health issues related to the study. The Public Health Service doctors, ironically, were now tasked with ensuring the men got the best care possible, an about-face from their previous role. The lawsuit settlement did not require an admission of formal wrongdoing, standard in such settlements. But by that point, the admission was moot. Everyone knew wrong was done. Still, some of the individual doctors and officials remained publicly defensive. Dr. John Heller, who had headed the The Venereal Disease Unit for many years insisted to the press that nothing unethical had been intended, and that the men were volunteers who received satisfactory care. These self-justifications rang hollow and were met with public scorn. The overall sentiment was that no excuse could wash away the stain. Heller and his colleagues retreated into obscurity, their reputations tarnished. Impact on medical institutions. In the fallout, the CDC and PHS underwent internal reckoning. There were personnel changes. Some who had been involved resigned or took early retirement. It was clear that the culture had to change. One direct outcome was that the medical schools and public health programs began incorporating medical ethics and lessons from Tuskegee into their curriculum. A generation of new doctors would be taught, remember Tuskegee and do not let it happen again. The community and cultural fallout, the African American community's reaction, beyond anger, included a deepened mistrust of health institutions. Historians and sociologists have noted that after 1972, there was a measurable decline in African American participation in medical programs and an increase in conspiracy theories about government health plots, like the belief that HIV and AIDS was deliberately introduced, a rumor partially fueled by well-founded distrust from Tuskegee. The term Tuskegee became a watchword. Black pastors and churches thundered about it from pulpits, urging their congregations to be cautious with doctors. Some patients, right or wrongly, began questioning every prescription. Doc, are you sure this isn't another Tuskegee you're doing on me? The medical establishment had to work to rebuild trust, a process still ongoing decades later. Recognizing this chasm of trust, in the immediate aftermath, a group of concerned individuals, including Black health professionals and some of the surviving men, came together to discuss how to heal. In 1973 and on, meetings in Tuskegee, Alabama were held. Out of these grew the idea for a Tuskegee Syphilis Study Legacy Committee, formally established in the mid-1990s. But even in the 70s, the seeds were planted for how to memorialize the victims and make something positive out of the tragedy. For the survivors, the years after 1972 were a mix of relief and lingering hurt. Relief that at last they knew the truth would get proper medical care. Hurt because that truth was a heavy burden to bear. They had to reconcile decades of lies. Some felt profound betrayal. They had genuinely loved Nurse Rivers and the doctors, and now realized that love was manipulated. Others were stoic, saying essentially, we're poor Black folk. We always knew we couldn't fully trust this white system, and this proves it. Many of the men, now in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, carried on with quiet dignity. A few gave interviews. One memorable voice was Herman Shaw, who emerged as a kind of spokesperson. Shaw expressed that he bore no ill will, but wanted to see lessons learned and the government do right by them from now on. In the late 1970s, as public attention turned elsewhere, Tuskegee still casts its shadow. It wasn't front page news anymore, but it lived on in discussions about bioethics, a field that blossomed partly in response to such scandals. University bioethics centers used Tuskegee as a case study, debating questions like, could the racism inherent in Tuskegee still influence research unconsciously? How to ensure voluntary informed consent truly means something, particularly when working with disadvantaged or illiterate populations, as in Tuskegee. The name became a grim shorthand in the medical papers. Ever since, Tuskegee researchers must be cautious too. By the late 70s, major reforms were codified. In addition to the IRBs, laws now demanded informed consent documentation for any federally funded research involving humans. The days of a doctor simply deciding what was best in the name of science without a subject's knowledge. These regulations, supervised by newly formed offices within HEW, later Health and Human Services, the HHS, aim to enforce ethics with the weight of law. Sorry to interrupt your regularly scheduled podcast, but this episode is brought to you by the Broken Truth merch. Support the show. Wear the truth. Official Broken Truth podcast merch is live now. Links in the description. And since you've made it this far in the episode, comment hashtag Broken Truth and leave us a 5-star review on your favorite platform. Because when you speak up, the algorithm listens. and so does the world. Interestingly, the scandal also had an influence beyond just human research. It spurred discussions about racism in healthcare more broadly. The US government, to its credit, did not ignore that dimension. In 1973, as part of the settlement, funding was earmarked for establishing the National Center for Bioethics Research and Healthcare at Tuskegee University. Though it took until the 1990s to actualize, the idea was to create a living memorial, a center that would study bioethics and race, training healthcare professionals to serve minority communities better. Throughout the 70s and 80s, survivors of the Tuskegee study continued living their lives quietly. The last years of this act drift into a calmer period. Public memory fades somewhat. New crises emerge in the world. But within the Black community, Tuskegee remains a cautionary tale told and retold. Each time a doctor recommends a new vaccine or a clinical trial comes to recruit participants, some might whisper, "Remember Tuskegee." That enduring mistrust is part of the fallout too, a scar on the landscape of public health. In 1979, the Belmont Report is published, and in 1981, the Federal Regulations for Human Research, the Common Rule, are officially adopted. The Tuskegee study is frequently cited in their preamble. It took the sacrifice, unwilling and unaware, of those 600 men to galvanize such change, a tragic cost for necessary reform. As the act draws to a close, the surviving Tuskegee men are now elders. They gather occasionally at annual reunions organized in Tuskegee, supported by the CDC's health benefits program. Photographs from those reunions show a dwindling group, smiles on weathered faces, often wearing their Sunday best, some with canes. The CDC sends doctors and nurses to checkups at these gatherings, a poignant inversion. Now the government is making house calls to care for them. There's a mixture of tenderness and sadness in these scenes. Tenderness because finally these men are being treated with the care and respect they deserved all along. Sadness because it came so late and only after so much harm. One cannot talk about without acknowledging that despite everything, no criminal charges were ever brought against the individuals who ran the Tuskegee study. There was no formal trial akin to Nuremberg for them. Why? Partly because at the time of the study's conduct, there were no specific laws they broke. Shockingly, it wasn't clearly illegal to do what they did. Unethical, yes, but our system didn't criminalize such research behavior then. By the time of exposure, most key figures were old or dead or retired. The focus thus went to systemic fixes and civil compensation rather than punitive justice. Some found this unsatisfying, that not a single doctor lost his pension or went to jail for it. But in practical terms, dragging them to court might have been a futile gesture. Instead, the legacy would be carried in reforms and, as we'll see, in efforts to memorialize what happened. Act 5 underscores that Tuskegee's fallout was not just about punishing a past wrong, but about building safeguards for the future. The men's suffering ignited a drive so that future generations would be safe from similar exploitation. As we move to the final act, we'll consider that broader legacy, how Tuskegee has been remembered, taught, and how it continues to influence both the Black community's relationship with medicine and the ethical framework of all scientific research. The formal aftermath may have settled by the late 1970s, but the legacy of Tuskegee was only beginning to take shape. The legacy of the Tuskegee Deception is both deep and far-reaching. In the decades since the study was exposed and ended, it has left an indelible mark on American society, and on the field of medicine and research, and on the collective memory, especially of African Americans. Act 6 explores how Tuskegee is remembered and how it has transformed policies, perceptions, and lives. A stain on the nation's conscience. In May 1997, a poignant scene unfolded in the East Room of the White House. Aged Black men, some in wheelchairs, some stooped with canes, gathered with their families. They wore suits and ties, looking both proud and wistful. These were the final survivors of the Tuskegee study, by then only 8 in number. They had been invited to the White House by the President of the United States to be honored and to receive something they had long deserved, an apology. Standing before a national TV audience, President Bill Clinton addressed them and the American people. The United States government did something that was wrong. deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. He said, with his voice heavy with emotion, "What was done cannot be undone. We can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away." He turned directly to the elderly men before him, calling them by name: Mr. Shaw, Mr. Pollard, Mr. Howard, and others. On behalf of the American people, Clinton continued, "I am sorry." As he spoke those words, some of the men nodded. Others had tears in their eyes. One of them, Herman Shaw, then about 94 years old, stood up and graciously accepted the apology on behalf of all affected families. He spoke of forgiveness, hoping that this acknowledgement could bind up the wounds, open the healing. This formal apology broadcast live was a symbolic capstone to the legacy of Tuskegee. It came 25 years after the story broke, and it marked the first time the government, at its highest level, took public responsibility. The apology was not just to the survivors, but to all African Americans and to every citizen who values justice. It acknowledged the lingering broken trust that Tuskegee had caused. President Clinton announced steps to rebuild that trust: the formation of a bioethics center at Tuskegee University, funding to help establish what became the Center for Bioethics in Research and Healthcare, which opened in 1999, and initiatives to ensure research is done ethically with community involvement, commemorating and educating all of this. In the 1990s, interest in Tuskegee was renewed as the 25th anniversary of its end approached. Documentaries like PBS's The Deadly Deception and articles revisited the story, ensuring new generations heard it. Tuskegee University established a legacy museum near the site of the old hospital where Miss Rivers' boys once went. This museum houses original medical equipment, copies of records, and personal items from participants. It tells the story from the perspective of the victims, ensuring they are remembered not as mere subjects, but as human beings who suffered an injustice. Visitors can see photographs of the men, young and strong in the 1930s, then older and frailer in later years, putting faces to the facts. The term Tuskegee itself has become part of the lexicon. Medical students are taught about the Tuskegee syphilis study in ethics classes as a prime example of what not to do. It's often mentioned alongside other dark chapters like the Nazi experiments or the radiation tests on unwitting civilians. Tuskegee has a particular resonance because it happened under our own flag, to our own citizens. It forces students and doctors to confront issues of racial bias in healthcare. Why were only Black men chosen? How did prejudice enable the rationalizations? Those questions remain painfully relevant as disparities persist in health outcomes and treatment. Perhaps the most profound legacy is the mistrust Tuskegee ingrained in many African Americans toward medical institutions. Even decades later, surveys reveal that a significant portion of the Black community is aware of Tuskegee, far more so than whites. And that awareness correlates with wariness and things like clinical trials, organ donation, or government vaccine programs. During the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, for assistance, public health experts repeatedly had to address Tuskegee when discussing vaccine hesitancy in Black communities. People would say, "I don't want to be a guinea pig like those men in Tuskegee," even though the context differs. The ghost of Tuskegee looms whenever trust in medicine is low. This mistrust has real consequences. There's research suggesting that after 1972, the life expectancy of Black men dipped relative to whites, in part due to reduced interaction with the medical system, a chilling echo that some attribute in part to the Tuskegee effect. Recognizing this, health leaders have tried to be proactive, partnering with Black churches, hiring more Black physicians, emphasizing transparency and community consent in research. Legacy of Tuskegee, then, has pushed some positive change in how researchers approach communities. They know trust must be earned, not assumed. On an institutional level, Tuskegee's legacy is visible in the rules that now govern all human research. Today, if a scientist wants to study a new treatment or even observe a group of people in a study, they must go through an institutional review board, IRB. That board asks tough questions. Are participants giving informed consent? Are they being fully informed of risks and benefits? Is the selection of subjects fair and equitable? No exploitation of a vulnerable group. Is there a plan to monitor their well-being and withdraw them if needed? These questions stem from principles laid out in the Belmont Report, principles influenced by Tuskegee and other ethical failures. We also now have the Office for Human Research Protections, OHRP, in the federal government, an entity set up after Tuskegee via the 1974 National Research Act and subsequent regulations, specifically to enforce human subject protection guidelines. Essentially, Tuskegee led to a whole framework of laws and oversight that try to make sure research subjects have autonomy and safety. Internationally, too, Tuskegee's infamy contributed to revisions of the Declaration of Helsinki, key document governing ethical medical research worldwide. The legacy has thus saved untold lives and preventing similar abuses from being repeated, at least in mainstream regulated research. What happens outside the law is another matter. But within official channels, Tuskegee is that red flag. The study also sparked a broader examination of racism in medical history. In the years since, historians have highlighted events like exploitation of Black bodies in slavery-era medical experiments, or the story of Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman whose cancer cells were taken without consent in 1951 and used extensively in research. Tuskegee often serves as the gateway for these discussions. It forces medicine to reckon with its past and present. Efforts like increasing diversity in clinical trials directly address one ironic flip side of Tuskegee. Fear of exploitation sometimes leads underrepresentation of minorities in research, which can be harmful too. For example, drugs not tested in diverse populations might not work as well for them. The only cure for distrust is sincere outreach and ethical consistency. Another part of Tuskegee's legacy has been to make the medical community painfully aware of that necessity. Tuskegee has seeped into culture, literature, theater, and even comic books have referenced it as a symbol. There's a Pulitzer-nominated play, Miss Evers' Boys, later an HBO film, which dramatizes the story through the eyes of Nurse Rivers, like character, wrestling with loyalty to her patients versus duty to the experiment. The play and film brought the story to many who never knew of it. There have been countless references in music and other art. For example, blues or hip-hop lyrics that mention bad blood or Tuskegee to signify betrayal. It's a story that, like a modern myth, warns of the dangers when trust is betrayed by those in power. The legacy is also personal for descendants. The last Tuskegee participant passed away in 2004. The last widow receiving medical benefits died in 2009, but children and grandchildren remain, some of whom also receive health benefits if they had conditions traceable to congenital syphilis. They carry the story of their father or grandfather. Some have become advocates, making sure people don't forget. In 2022, the Milbank Memorial Fund, one of the funders of the study's early phase before it went rogue, apologized to descendants for its role, showing how even many decades on, institutions connected to Tuskegee still feel the need to atone and make amends. When you visit Tuskegee, Alabama today, beyond the university's well-kept campus, you find the grave sites of a few men who were in the study. They might not have fancy headstones. Some are in modest church graveyards, but every year or so, a small ceremony might take place where locals and scholars, and sometimes relatives, gather to lay wreaths or say prayers in their memory. This is part of the legacy too, remembering the names and lives behind the term Tuskegee study. The Legacy Committee in 1996 had a goal that was not just an apology, but also education and remembrance. They wanted a center at Tuskegee, which exists, and an ongoing conversation about ethics and race, which continues. In sum, Tuskegee's legacy is dual. It is a cautionary tale that still fuels mistrust and demands vigilance, reminding us how easily prejudice and unethical thinking can infect even well-established institutions. But it's also a catalyst for positive change. Many of the protections we take for granted in modern medicine are there because Tuskegee showed us what happens in their absence. It galvanized Black Americans to demand respect in healthcare and to take seats at the table in medical decision-making, whether as researchers, reviewers, or community advisors. One might say the legacy is still evolving. Each time a new public health campaign is launched, officials think about Tuskegee. and plan how to engage communities transparently. Each time a research trial begins, IRBs channel the lessons of Tuskegee by asking, are we fully respecting our participants? Finally, Tuskegee's legacy is a human one. It resides in the voices of men like Charles Pollard, who said, after the truth came out, we were treated unfairly, to some extent like guinea pigs. The only thing I knew was that they just kept saying I had the bad blood. They never mentioned syphilis to me, not even once. It resides in the grace of Herman Shaw, who forgave but insisted on recognition. It lives on in every patient who now asks their doctor a skeptical question, and in every doctor who knows they must earn their patient's trust, not assume it. It is a story that will continue to be retold, not to open old wounds for pain's sake, but to ensure those wounds finally heal cleanly by never letting such deception occur again. As we conclude this journey through the Tuskegee Deception, we reflect on what it has taught us. That truth and respect are the bedrock of medicine, and without them, the noblest science can descend into cruelty. The men of Tuskegee, in their suffering, unwittingly became teachers to the world. We owe them a debt of remembrance, and the commitment that their ordeal, however broken in truth it was, gave rise to a better, more honest future in healthcare. The story of the Tuskegee Deception is a stark reminder of what happens when trust is betrayed and ethics are cast aside. For 40 years, hundreds of men were deceived by those sworn to heal, their lives treated as mere means to an end. This was not just a tragedy for the families of Macon County, Alabama. It was a tragedy for the nation's moral conscience. Yet, from that darkness, light emerged in the form of a hard-earned lesson and reform. Today, every informed consent form is signed. Every research oversight meeting convened. Every outreach to build trust in a hesitant community carries, in its DNA, the legacy of Tuskegee. In remembering this chapter, we honor the resilience of the men who endured it and the bravery of those who brought the truth to light. Their story has changed the course of medical history, ensuring that never again is not just a phrase, principle in research and care. It is a legacy written in both sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the injustice that occurred, hope for the change that follows. As we close this episode of the Broken Truth podcast, we reflect on the Tuskegee's studies, enduring message that integrity and compassion must be the foundation of science, and that the voices of the vulnerable must never be silenced. In shining a light on this broken truth, we do more than recount a historical episode. We reinforce our commitment to honesty, justice, and respect for all in the ongoing story of medicine and society. Thank you for listening to this comprehensive exploration. May the lessons of Tuskegee continue to guide us toward a future where such a deception can never take root, and where the truth and trust between caregivers and communities remain unbroken.
In a world built on hidden histories and half-truths, we've only just begun to peel back the layers. Because what you've heard tonight was never meant to be known, but you were meant to find it. If you're ready to go deeper, leave us a review, comment your thoughts, share this episode, and step inside the archives. Join the inner circle, where the real evidence is kept. This is the broken truth, because the truth isn't whole, it's broken.